All right, this is your second um, PowerPoint for Humanities 2, and this covers the first half of Chapter 9. Basically, Chapter 9 up to the English Renaissance, Shakespearean or Elizabethan England. All right, so we start off this chapter with the Reformation. So what is the Reformation? This was a period of intense change culturally, religiously, socially in the world. Perhaps the greatest change since the empowerment of the Catholic Church. This was the breakdown of the Catholic Church. And it started with a guy named Martin Luther. And Luther wasn't setting out to change the world. What he was angry with was what he thought was corruption within the Catholic Church. In particular, there were two issues he had the biggest problems with. One, he felt that the Catholic Church was trying to become almost usurping of God's power by giving things what they called indulgences, in which, say you wanted to cheat on your wife, and you knew this was sinful. So what you would do is you would turn around and you would go to your priest and you'd say, how much would it cost me to have my sin removed? And the priest would say, well, it depends on the sin. And you guys would negotiate and they would charge you a fee, and then he would give you an absolution for a future sin. Luther thought this was wrong, and he definitely felt it was something that was corrupting the church. The other big issue he had is he felt the Catholic Church was trying to put themselves between believers and God, and he thought believers could speak directly to God and interpret the Bible themselves. At this time, the Catholic Church gave Mass in Latin, and the Bible was only written in Latin. Most people were barely literate in the language they spoke, certainly not in the language of the dead, an intellectual language. So this Reformation, which started with Luther basically nailing this 95 points that he felt the church needed to fix on the walls of a major church, spawned a Reformation that changed Catholicism and broke it by creating what is now called the Protestant churches. And they're called Protestant basically because they were protesting against Catholic doctrine. And there were a lot of different issues that started to come up. Theologically, it really sparked this debate of Christianity over free will and human nature, and how much of a choice we have in our own future and destiny. This is a big issue. Intellectually, it really started the idea of Christian humanism. And reformers and humanists, though they sharply disagreed on a lot of issues, began to see also some commonalities. And of course, socially, it appealed to the German people who felt the Catholic Church was taxing them heavily and constantly asking for more and more money. So Luther argued among these treatises that only baptism and the Holy Communion or the Eucharist have biblical precedent. Things like indulgences, he didn't see any precedent in the Bible. Nor did he see a precedent in the Bible for the celibacy of the priests. He thought priests could marry, and in fact, after he left the Catholic Church to start Lutheranism, he himself married. He also had a little bit of a problem with the authority of the Pope. He felt that the Pope was gaining too much authority and was being really the seating between the worshiper and God, and he felt that that was a direct line. And he cited the Apostle Paul to validate this, where Paul says in Ephesians 2, chapter 2, verse 8 and 9, "For by grace you are saved by faith, not by works." So the Catholic Church was more and more becoming this program in which you could work your way out of hell or work your way out of purgatory. And even purgatory was something that Luther didn't see evidence of in the Bible, but rather felt that the Catholic Church created it so that it would have this kind of holding cell that you could then, gain parole from. And of course, as I said, this absolution that you could purchase, which is called papal indulgence. Luther's act of defiance against the Catholic Church didn't result, though, in him being declared a heretic, which had previously been the response of the Catholic Church to anyone who argued against it. And the reason was that Luther, being in Germany, had a powerful German nobleman protecting him, and a very rich nobleman. And again, Germany was feeling that the Catholic Church, which was mostly in Italy, was kind of using Germany as just a source of funding and wasn't really reaching the people. And Luther, for his credit, as his first act after posting treatises and setting this break with the Catholic Church, went and took the Bible and translated it into German, so that he put his money where his mouth was, basically, and gave the people a direct line to God, which was one of his biggest issues. Europe at the time was ripe for this doctrine because there was a growing amount of these humanistic individuals that didn't view humanity as this evil, sinful creature the way the Catholic Church often had presented it. And they instead thought there was some religious corruption, and they didn't like the ignorance that was being presented from the church, and they certainly didn't like the idea of the church taking and holding all the ancient text and kind of having a monopoly on knowledge. The humanists also approved of Luther's preference for kind of a simple piety, simple worship rather than elaborate mass and elaborate ritual. However, Luther's reformers differed from humanists in, first of all, Luther wasn't convinced that humans were noble. He felt they were sinful. And he also felt they could not achieve salvation but through the grace of God. Whereas humanists kind of believed that humanity was inherently good. Luther believed that humanity was inherently sinful, and only through God could they gain salvation. And you got to remember, at this time period, heaven and hell were real places for most people. Darwin's theories hadn't existed yet, so there wasn't this option of science. You kind of had to go through religion if you wanted to believe in an afterlife, and people wanted to believe in an afterlife. I couldn't resist, since we're talking about Reformation. After Luther, one of our next major reformists in the Protestant movement was Calvinism. Calvinism, in this cartoon from Calvin and Hobbes, kind of really focuses on one aspect of Calvinism. Calvinism had this belief that God, who is all-knowing, would know whether you were going to heaven or hell. So therefore, whatever you did didn't matter. Instead, what you should concentrate on is looking and seeing if there's any evidence of God's choice for you. So the idea of free will goes away, and you're predestined to either go to heaven or be damned to hell. And suddenly wealth becomes a major factor. Whereas previously there was this call of poverty and giving of your resources to others as Christ commanded. Now you had Calvin saying, wait a second here. God gave you that wealth. Therefore, that's a sign that he thinks you're a good person and that you're going to heaven. So we often call this the tulip of Calvinism. These 5 elements. Total depravity. Calvinism believed that man is sinful and incapable of redemption. You were basically, from the moment you were conceived, either a sinner or a select, someone who was going to heaven. U, which stands for unconditional election, meaning God elects or saves. Elects means takes to heaven. Those for salvation, and the terms are unconditional. God chooses you, and there's nothing you can do to stop it, and there's nothing you can do to warrant it. It's all up to God. L, limited atonement. The idea here, which was different than what other, especially Luther, was preaching, was that Christ died, Christ's atonement, his ability to sacrifice himself for others, only is for the elect, the one that God chooses. Not everyone's entitled. God knows whether you're entitled, no one else does. I, irresistible grace. God's grace is irresistible for the elect and did not receive it as a reward. In other words, there's nothing you did that caused God to choose you as saved. Your choices are irrelevant. God picks you, and only he knows why. And P, the persistence of grace. And this is, again, an idea that differs heavily from the Catholic Church. And that was that grace cannot be lost or rejected. God chooses you, and that's the final say. You can't sin your way out of heaven, and you can't reject God. So Calvinism, and Calvin created it. He based his ideas out of the Institute of Christian Religion. That was his so-called church. And Calvin defined Protestant doctrine and became the Reformation's most widely read theological work. So he really starts to represent what is Protestantism. It elaborated the principle of predestination, the idea that belief that God determines before you're even born which Christians will gain salvation. But the question then became, how would a believer know if they were predestined for heaven, if they were the righteous elect? Well, Calvin had an answer to that. And his answer was to define hard work and earned wealth as visible signs of election. Meaning, if you worked yourself very hard, you weren't lazy, you weren't indulgent, and you gained lots of money, well, that was a sign that God felt you were worthy of heaven. So, religiously obedient, the Calvinists were politically rebellious, challenging the authority of rulers over God's people. They felt only God knew what was right. We see Calvinism still spreading today in the wealth evangelists. These evangelists who believe that you are a successful Christian if you are wealthy. This also led to the Protestant work ethic. Sociologist Max Weber, who wrote and studied in the late 1800s, early 1900s, coined this term, the Protestant work ethic, to describe this kind of industriousness encouraged by Calvin's theology. This idea of if you work really hard and earn lots of money, it's proof that you're going to heaven. So if believers cannot earn salvation, Weber asked, how can they know if they belong to God's elect, if they're going to heaven? Those destined for salvation and everlasting life. Well, again, Calvin's answer, according to Weber, was to define hard work and wealth as visible signs of election. Thus, wealth was a sign of God's blessing so long as it was not misused in idleness, leisure, or spontaneous enjoyment of material possessions. In other words, gaining wealth was good. Spending wealth, not so good. So the essential features of Weber's Protestant work ethic was work until you die, self-denial, let's not indulge and buy fancy things, and the moral virtue of wealth for wealth's sake. And we still see this in Western attitudes and behaviors. Again, we see this especially in the wealth evangelists. This led us to King's Commerce and, of course, Columbus. So while Luther was recasting the religious landscape, we also started to see more wealth grow, and monarchs became stronger and gained more power and accumulated a stronger power base. So they fostered commerce within their borders, and then also sponsored further and further exploration. This was really the time when there was a push to go see what the world looked like and what kind of riches might be there. So there was a push for exploration into Africa, Asia, and especially eventually the New World. In France, Louis XI we gained territories from England and strengthened his powers to levy taxes. In Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella combined their thrones, regional thrones, and ended what was a long Muslim rule in southern Spain that had resulted from the Crusades. Henry VII of England kind of ended this period here, ended the period of civil war. Sorry, I should have been period, not period, the dot, the word period. He ended a period of civil war and established the Tudor dynasty, which of course led to the famous monarchs of Henry VIII and of course Elizabeth I. So finances grew in Europe as the church began to relax its rules and especially its taxes. With Protestantism forming, the church either had to cut its taxes or risk losing more to Protestantism. And also the church began to lend more money. Remember, the church was heavy bankers. They were charging interest and loaning money to people and monarchs. And we also started to see the rise of what becomes the middle class as farmers started being able to divide up large lords' estates and planted cash crops. And we started to see a rise in merchants and small businessmen. But that was not the only commercial revolution in Europe, as this exploration and colonization of the Americas became popular. Columbus, of course, really opened up this new world to European conquest. He had gone, we all know, to try to find an easier way to the Middle East, a way that didn't involve going through Egypt and running the risk of some of the Muslim warriors that still existed there to get to India and Asia, China. And instead, he ended up in the New World, which gave us a new cash crops, including tobacco, and gave us, more importantly, slaves. So we saw the Spanish conquistadors subdue the Aztec and Inca empires in Central and South America, and they seized fantastic treasures, especially gold and other precious metals. The indigenous American people were devastated not just by the conquest of soldiers with better military equipment, but also European diseases. And many were, those that did survive past the disease were enslaved to work in gold and silver mines. This influx of precious metals made Spain the wealthiest nation, sorry, it should be in Europe, and fueled commercial revolution. This commercial traffic shifted Europe, again, it should be Europe, balance of economic power away from Italy to the American ports, the Atlantic ports, excuse me, of London in England and Amsterdam in the Netherlands. So we have a cartoon here that says, with guys that look like they're in hazmat suits saying, please step this way so we can take your temperature. And of course, that's referencing the intense disease that was brought in by these explorers. The Ottoman Empire. First, I have two cartoons here. One is kind of make fun of how Christopher Columbus discovered America, and here it's talking about Apple Maps, telling me that that is India instead of Jamaica. And we see another one with Columbus landing and the natives saying, India, gee, not only did you get the wrong country, but the wrong continent. I mean, a country I can understand, but a whole continent. So as Columbus made his famous voyage towards India, there was a good reason he did not sail east. And that reason was the Ottoman Empire, which by 1500 had conquered the ancient Byzantine Empire and ruled most of Islam's capitals west of Persia. Again, a very strong military, very hard to get through. As Europe's smaller nation states were creating the early modern world, the Ottomans' vast realm remained cohesive but relatively stagnant. Its very efficacy suppressed the dynamic change by which Europe surged ahead. When European imperial powers divided the Ottoman Empire after World War II, they formed what is now many of the Middle East nations and its territories, meaning Iran, Iraq, India, Pakistan. All of those were part of the Ottoman Empire that were then divided up arbitrarily. Hence the reason we've got some issues. While this is happening, we have the Renaissance starting in Northern Europe. The economic prosperity and royal power spurred an extravagant court life in Northern Europe. We start to see art really progress with geniuses like Leonardo da Vinci, Hans Holbein, who were sponsored by kings like Francis I and Henry VIII, respectively. And we saw the revitalization of an older art form in the form of tapestries. Though the Northern Renaissance kings engaged in substantial building programs, their architecture was still mostly in the medieval tradition with Italian-style classicism. They hadn't really broken into a new field. Faith and humanism. And we see these two social views start to form in Northern art. Rather than fresco, Northern painters preferred the luxurious medium of oil paint, which enabled them to render precise details and to overpaint, to put layer upon layer, creating texture as well as color and design. So rather than plastered walls, northern churches were often decorated with elaborate wooden altarpieces that were cabinets with hinged doors that opened to display religious scenes. And of course, one of the masters of Northern Realism was John van Eyck, a Flemish painter who excelled in jewel-like detail and vivid colors. And here is some of Jan's work. Here is Adam and Eve and one of his cabinet frescoes, cabinets that are painted again with some oil paint. And unfortunately, that picture's a little blurry, but we have here Hieronymus Bosch. In contrast with Van Eyck's benign realism, Hieronymus Bosch employed his brush to paint kind of a dark world of, this idea of kind of fantasy and a little bit of darkness and evil. So you can kind of see here, we have a lot of fantastical pieces. In fact, you can look, you'll see little demons and nymphs and all kinds of strange and weird creatures as part of his painting. Along with that, we have Albrecht Dürer. He was the first genuinely humanist artist in the Northern Renaissance. Dürer was trained as an engraver, and you can see a lot of that engraving work in here. In Nuremberg, which was Germany's thriving print trade. Remember, Germany was getting big on printing as Luther started printing, the Bible. However, the young artist was not kind of satisfied as an artist who dutifully executed his patron's orders. Like Da Vinci and other Italian masters, he kind of wanted to exalt the artist's standing as a thinker and a creator. Dürer wrote, and this is a quote from him, "Here I am a gentleman, there I am a parasite." More than the Italian Renaissance masters, Dürer praised the artist as genius and justified the artist's vocation. He continued on, "Through instruction would like to be competent in many things and would not tire thereof. For nature has implanted in us the desire of knowing all things. If we want to sharpen our reason by learning and to practice ourselves therein, having once found the right path, we may, step by step, seek, learn, comprehend, and finally reach and attain some of the truths." So he was part of this growing artistic movement that viewed art as a way of reaching the truths of humanity, of seeing the face of God. Woodcutting and engraving, as the print trade became more and more profitable, as people were able to read and books were printed, we saw a lot more of these wood cuttings and engravings. And they had an immediacy kind of like the way photography works today and video. And they were frequently used as kind of weapons in political and religious controversy. So for example, pictured here is Dürer's engraving Night, Death, and the Devil, which may be an illustration of a religious text from his time period. Dürer's resolute Christian knight sits astride a well-proportioned horse and shows no fear of death at his side. He's holding an hourglass, or of the grotesque devil disguised as a wild boar. So it's kind of looks like it's trying to depict what was a religious piece at the time with great detail. In contrast to Dürer, we have Peter Bruegel, who showed Bruegel, philosophical, who showed little interest in the Italian technique or the humanism debate. Bruegel expressed a profound affection for nature's beauty and kind of a simple life of Flemish peasants. This was this beginning of the artist looking at just simple realism and simple life. He depicted common people. Again, this is kind of strange because before that, most artists would depict royalty and wealthy, because after all, they were usually the patrons. But Bruegel saw beauty in the common man. And he often depicted scenes of daily life that achieved kind of a breathtaking perspective and philosophical sophistication. He saw the beauty in just average, everyday lifestyles. The picture I have here is hunters in the snow, and it's the failure of the hunt is evident. We can see in how the dogs kind of look sad and droopy. The hunters did not find their prey. So the group on the left are preparing, this group back here, are preparing to slaughter a hog, and look like they've got a feast going to be going on. We got fire, and there appears to be some happiness. You can see a little bit better here. And then we have the foreground action as the eyes kind of follow through and push. You can see this motion down and then over. The foreground, the eyes follow the trees down the hill to the skaters, right here, in the background. And then the skaters are obviously the returning hunters and seemed insignificant against the vast landscape. And then we have a single bird floating across the sky, unifying the human drama with the timeless alpine peaks in the upper right. So we start here, we go down, we go up, we go in, bringing us back around. So we get that nice circular motion of good artwork. Aramis and humanism. The most important and famous Christian humanist was Desiderius Aramis, whose translations and writings kind of embodied the spirit of piety and humble learning. He was ordained as a priest in the year that Columbus sailed, 1492, and he began a campaign to free the church from corruption and scholastic pretension, while himself pursuing a life of quiet devotion and moral virtue. This begins this movement of religion into a Puritanism. In Aramis, in his book In Praise of Folly, which was an expose of the vanity and corruption in Renaissance society. In Praise of Folly was the Renaissance's greatest example of satire. We've seen satire before in some of the ancient Greek work, but this begins a satire that stays throughout the modern era. In Praise of Folly takes aim at the hypocrisy and vanity of Renaissance society and contrasts its vices with the inner piety and moral strivings that lead to Christian salvation. Speaking in the satirical voice of Folly, a character, Aramis rails against the folly of war, especially practiced by warrior popes like Julius II. Folly, again a character, reserves her most biting criticism for Aramis's constant adversaries, the scholastic theologians. In the author's view, the pretensions of the scholastics kept them from true piety. Folly suggests that the study of the Bible itself should replace scholastic commentary and church dogma. While readers are delighted with Aramis's mockery of lawyers, merchants, monks, and theologians, his satire earned him intellectual enemies throughout Europe. reason enough for scholars to seek protection, for the scholars to seek protection from the Pope. So he was trying to show society's evil ways, and got in trouble a little bit, particularly with the intellectuals of his time. So despite his differences with the church, he remained distant from Martin Luther's reforms, both for his philosophical reasons and again for self-preservation. Unlike Luther, who was preserved by a German nobleman, Aramis had to seek protection from the Pope. Philosophically, Aramis held the humanist view that people were, by free acts of will, able to improve themselves morally. On the other hand, Luther saw humans as absolutely dependent on God's grace for salvation. So Aramis believed you could work your way into salvation. Luther believed it was a gift from God. Aramis finally voiced his disagreement with Luther in a critical treatise entitled De Libero Arbitrario, on the freedom of the will, which challenged Luther's belief in human sinfulness. Luther replied with his own pamphlet, because that's what you did back then, poignantly titled De Servio Arbitrario, on the slavery of will, which argued that nothing good came from human freedom. Aramis agreed with the reformers that God's word was the supreme and piety was more important than good works, but he never abandoned Catholic faith or his belief in human freedom and self-determination. This led us to Thomas More and Utopia. Thomas More was chiefly interested in criticizing the greed, violence, and corruption in contemporary England, rather than seriously proposing some kind of utopian way of life. Again, he started out as satire, but was taken a little too seriously. More's Utopia was a rather cheerless republic of industrious austerity. Its citizens all wore the same plain woolen clothing and went to bed at 8 o'clock. Evening lectures offered education and self-improvement. Illicit sex was severely punished because otherwise, More suggested, citizens would have no reason to get married. More reserved his sharpest criticism for greed. While utopians met their material needs with a few hours' labor, by contrast, English society seemed more like a conspiracy of the rich to advance their own interests under the pretext of organizing society. And thus, More's piece started this motif of utopian societies, and even may be one of the first cases of science fiction, in that More created this perfect society, or at least a society he claimed was perfect. Underneath, though, there was some question about that perfection. More described an alternate society of Christian justice and piety in his book Utopia. In essence, the Christian answer to Plato's Republic. The title of More's book meant literally no place. So it described a fictional island where industrious citizens had solved the problems of war, poverty, and crime. And since the book's publication, we have had stories trying to create utopias. Perhaps the most famous modern day one is that of the Star Trek universe. Thomas More was chiefly interested in criticizing, again, like I said, the greed, violence, and corruption in England, rather than seriously proposing a utopian way of life. I kind of already said all this. In this world, everybody dressed the same, everybody had the same activities, and again, one of the bigger issues was no sex, unless for marriage and procreation purposes. Not really a society that's going to be successful. So what about you guys? What do you think? Have you ever read a piece of a utopian or seen a film that had a utopian society like Star Trek? And how would you describe your perfect society? Again, you don't have to write this down. I just want you to kind of think about it. Is there a such thing as a utopian society? Maybe there isn't. And if they're even in Moore's utopia, there was this kind of feeling underneath that perhaps it wasn't that perfect, that there were some problems. I mean, after all, would you want to dress like everybody else? Would you want to have no fun or entertainment? Would you want to have no sex? So, you know, this idea of a society with no war, no poverty, no crime, yeah, it sounds good, but no individuality, no freedom, that's not so good either. All right, so we will, there is a journal quiz and a discussion for this week, and then there'll be more next time. Be another PowerPoint next week. All right, take care, and next week we'll be on the English Reformation or the English Renaissance and Elizabethan England.